WATR. 29 minutes after 10 o'clock, Ben Zimmer is across from me, the executive director of a group called the Connecticut Policy Institute. And Ben, why don't you give me your take on what this institute is in relation to, say, Connecticut Voices for Children, the Connecticut Yankee Institute. I mean, what role do you play here? And then we'll talk about Tom Foley's involvement in this.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. In terms of the type of work we do, putting out policy papers and organizing events, I would say we're similar to a group like Voices for Children or Yankee Institute. I think the difference is both of those are fairly upfront, that they have a certain ideological bent, one liberal, one conservative, and I think we try to aim for more of a middle ground and really try to focus on areas where ideology is clouding practical judgment, or where political interests, politicians' interests from either party are interfering with good common sense policy. Oh,
well, that's, you could actually expand your purview, because that's going on all across the country.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, there was an article called Think Tank Warfare. Numbers don't lie unless it's fuzzy math. Therein lies the debate being waged by Governor Malloy's administration and a self-proclaimed nonpartisan think tank founded by Malloy's chief detractor, Republican Tom Foley. Now, again, I don't think Tom Foley has been his chief detractor over this period. Over this period, he's had people within the legislature like John McKinney and Larry Rifkin, who I think have taken him on much more frontally. But Tom Foley's role in establishing the Connecticut Policy Institute, let's just get that on the table.
Yeah, absolutely. We're very upfront about that. Tom founded the Institute and gave about $60,000 of seed funding for it. And in the early stages of the Institute, he was, fairly involved in helping to write the papers and things like that. But he set up the Institute to be independent from him, and over time we've, moved increasingly in that direction. He still sits on our advisory board, but not on our formal corporate board. We're financially independent from him at this point. And so, he's at this point just one of a number of voices that provide input and thoughts into what we do. But the notion, as some people say, that this is kind of his group is they can say it all they want, but it's just factually incorrect.
Okay. So he's given, I think, in total, I read about $80,000. Is that correct?
That's correct. Okay.
And who is the chairman of the board of the Institute?
So we have a corporate board that doesn't sort of formal corporate board that has a few of the members of our advisory board, which have, about 10 people on it, and you can go to our website and see who they are. So they're the ones who kind of, provide oversight and guide the Institute. But ultimately, I'm the one who has sort of final say on what we do and do not publish, what we do and do not do. And then we have a number of fellows and, part-time staffers and people working with me who help produce the work.
Okay. And Ben, your background is?
My background is I'm a lawyer by training from Yale Law School, where I focused on economic policy issues. I also worked at McKinsey in the private sector, and actually served on the Obama transition team, on their energy policy team. So I'm an unaffiliated voter. I've voted for Democrats and Republicans. So my friends laugh when they see allegations that I'm a Republican political shill. Yeah.
Okay, well, 27 minutes before 11 o'clock, and listen, I brought you in here, but I wanted to get the background kind of understood by those who are listening. You've done Connecticut's Economic Scorecard and published July 2013, Economic Performance, Fiscal Policy, Health Outcomes, Workforce Quality, Regulatory Climate. So you were really taking a big swath of what it is that a state does, and quality of life issues as well as financial solvency. Why did you take such a large look at the state of Connecticut?
Well, we've seen in the last few months a lot of these rankings that come out, and they really are sort of all over the place. One week you see a ranking that Connecticut is the worst state. The next week you see a ranking that Connecticut is the best state. And so we sort of sat down, it was actually the idea of one of the members of our advisory board, not Tom, to say, let's take a look from a kind of broader perspective rather than focusing and picking and choosing metrics to suit a particular agenda, and try to take a broad look at the state, both both historically and today, and try to get a sense of what's really going on here. And so that's why we took a broad look, and across those different dimensions, we have about 20, 25 specific metrics, and we don't try to put together some sort of single, manipulable
Yes.
We just let the data speak for itself. And in some cases, that data makes, says good things about Connecticut. Like, we are a relatively wealthy state. We do have relatively high educational attainment of our workforce. And in other areas, in my view, probably the majority, it doesn't make us look so good.
Well, I'll tell you, what I came away with was a sense that we are trading on a really strong past. And yet a lot of the capital that we were left with, we've been kind of frittering away for a long period of time. And a lot of what we think about ourselves was rooted in another time, another era. And it just seems as if, again, we've given a lot of those advantages away.
And I think that's precisely true. And really, to me, as well, one of the key takeaways of the report is Connecticut has all this, wealth and human capital from past investments, but the policies of today are, highest in the Northeast tax rates other than New York, and among the highest in the country, among the highest debt in the country. All of this, or debt per capita, obviously, all of this leads to our wealth and human capital eroding. You hear a lot about the achievement gap in Connecticut being among the highest in the country, and though we do remain a strong state in terms of educational attainment, that's slipped a lot in the past 15, 20 years. And same thing with our wealth. We're still a wealthy state, but last 2 years we've had the worst economic growth in the country. You're not going to stay the wealthiest state for long with that. And so, exactly as you said, you've seen these advantages slipping, and the trajectory is poor.
Okay. Now, if you would like to join us as you hear some of this information being put forward, if you have any questions about it, Ben can take your questions, 203-757-1320. And what I like about what you did, and I want to make certain that people know that he went to all kinds of sources, and he gives you the data source, like the Bureau of Economic Analysis, for the one on economic performance and income growth. He'll go to the U.S. Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So he is documenting where, but it's very, very well laid out so that individuals like us, just common folks, we can take a look at this data. And the other thing that I like about it, where Connecticut ranks, higher rank equals more growth in the USA, he'll put us where we are among the states, and then even in the Northeast, because I think one of the things that the governor told us at the beginning of his term was that he wanted to take whatever markers there were about Connecticut in relation to our neighbors, and he wanted to strengthen our rankings relative to these other states, make us more competitive, more inviting. So this was one of the things that he said he was going to look at benchmarks across the region. And yet, when I look at some of these performance numbers, we oftentimes are finding ourselves 8 of 9 in the Northeast or 9 of 9. So let's go into the one on economic performance, income growth, 2012 change in the gross domestic product. Now, just so everybody understands that, that's the total of our economy here in the state of Connecticut.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Okay. The United States grew 2.5%, which I think actually you're giving the United States more benefit than I would. The Northeast grew at 1.3%. Connecticut went down by 0.1%. So Connecticut was 9 of 9 in the Northeast. So Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, New York, they all grew at a greater...
Yeah,
Rhode Island?
Even Rhode Island, all of these states grew at a faster rate than we did. And I think, what that tells me at least is that the problem is internal to our policies. You hear a lot about these, our current leaders will talk about these macroeconomic forces, European bond markets affecting, jobs in Connecticut. And yes, they do affect jobs in Connecticut, but they don't affect jobs in Connecticut more than they affect jobs in Massachusetts or Rhode Island.
The governor told us that we have such active trade going on with Europe that it's the European recession. That was one I heard recently.
Yeah, that seems to me like deflecting responsibility. Again, we have some trade going on with Europe, but, the notion that the Europeans aren't thinking about who's in what state. We're a country for a reason, and the sorts of things that are leading to our stagnant economy are, the policies in the state of Connecticut. And in the last few months, you've seen reports of a lot of, companies leaving Connecticut, or I think Pepperidge Farms recently announced that they were expanding, but outside of, they chose, even though they're headquartered here, to expand outside the state.
I gave them the approval, as long as they could get the Chesapeakes and the Milanos back here in time, so I still had 2 weeks to eat the package.
Exactly.
I'm okay with that. Now,
I agree.
Now, 2009 to 2012 change in gross domestic product. So the first number I gave you, folks, was just this year, the 2012 change. Let's go to 2009 to 2012. The U.S. grew 6.65% cumulatively over all that period. That's after the debacle, of course. The Northeast grew 2.69%. Connecticut 1.01%. Again, putting us at the bottom in the Northeast and 48 out of 50 in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a sad story. And again, what that tells me is that it's not just sort of year-to-year fluctuations, that there's a broader pattern we see here of Connecticut's economy underperforming. And, when you look at some of the other things in that scorecard are, middle-class taxes are the second highest in the Northeast other than New York, among top 5 worst in the country. Our debt per capita is about the highest in the country and in the region. Our spending is extremely high. And so it's not really that surprising that when companies are picking to expand, they're not picking our state, and that some companies already here are reducing their activities or moving elsewhere.
Okay, now, you go into 2012 per capita GDP. So here is one where Connecticut looks really good, where we, the per capita in terms of individual, 54,925, the Northeast, 45,349, the U.S., 42,784. Now, would that be equivalent to median income, or how do we look at that?
Yeah, so that's basically the total number. It would be equivalent to mean income.
Mean.
So
okay.
It's the total number of, it's the total GDP divided by the number of people in the state.
Okay. So people might take that and hold on to it and say, you see, we're still a very wealthy state. We come out first in the Northeast, fourth in the United States. And so, what are we all complaining about? But a lot of that wealth, let's be honest about it, is so skewed to a certain handful of people. I mean, let's be honest,
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, and it's an issue in Connecticut, it's an issue nationally of the extent to which there's this, gross, disparity in incomes and wealth. And obviously a lot of Connecticut cities are suffering in particular. And, that's a major area where we need to be improving. But yeah, it's just a few people that have the wealth. And Connecticut for decades has been one of the wealthiest states. So it's not, again, like we were talking about before, that wealth to some degree is a legacy of past investments. And, even when it is, even when it is concentrated, it can still benefit the state through tax revenues and things like that. But when you start to see that eroding over time, it will sort of impact, the state as a whole.
Well, it's interesting, Ben, because I had one state official on. I'm not certain if it was Kevin Lembo or another individual. I think it probably was Kevin, talking about how small a number of people, because of the tax changes that were going on in Washington, had an impact on last year's budget. When we see that we've got a surplus this year, it's startling to see how few people we relied upon to make decisions that somehow benefited the state, but that was a one-time only situation.
Yeah, well, first of all, the whole notion that we had a surplus is a bit of talk about fuzzy math, because we borrowed over $1 billion to get that surplus, and so
we earned that, man.
Yeah, and so it's hardly a real surplus. But I think and I have heard Kevin Lembo speak about this, who I think is doing a great job, and has been a very good voice for honesty in the state. One of the things I've heard him talk about is the estate tax revenues this year were particularly high, and that's absolutely not something you can count on every year. That's subject to these sort of wild fluctuations. So to the extent we do have this alleged surplus, it's already based on a bit of a fluke. But even more than that, I would question how much this surplus is not just a question of accounting maneuvers rather than real revenues.
Well, one of the reasons I think you and I like his voice is because it's so distinctive because there aren't too many voices telling us just about anything that we can, really pin truth on. Now, change in per capita GDP from 2009 to 2012. You looked at the United States. It was 4.23%, and this comes from the University of New Mexico Bureau of Business and Economic Research, and using various census data. The Northeast was 5.46%. Connecticut was 0.20%. So we ranked 43rd in the nation, 9th of all. And by the way, there's only 9 states in the Northeast, so we were last.
Yeah. So again, I mean, you hear some of these reports that rank Connecticut very high. They talk about how it's such a wealthy state, and it is, wealth doesn't disappear overnight, thankfully, but it does disappear over decades, and it does disappear over years, and you're starting to see already, yes, we're 4th in the country in our per capita GDP, but that's not growing, it's shrinking. And so in, 5-10 years when this report comes out, if we stay on the current trajectory, we'll be much lower.
Yeah, these are the trends, folks, that we've got to look at because, we can rest on our laurels and we can remember. And of course, the Republican American over the weekend reminding us of this great industrial past that we're now trying to clean up after. But it's gone. And so what is the new Connecticut? I mean, what does it look like? What does it feel like? And how many of you have a lot of confidence that we have figured out the way out of the wilderness? Because we've been in a wilderness for 20 or 30 years now trying to figure all this out, and nobody has really come up with anything distinctive about our character, how we're going to grow it. I mean, have you seen anything? Obviously, the aerospace industry is still strong. We were reading that insurance jobs and financial jobs, which are really center to Connecticut's, economy, that they've been flagging a bit in the recent period. I mean, what do you see as drivers going forward?
Drivers of positive change, you mean? I think in terms of what we need going forward, I think it's a misconception when you're thinking about policy and managing an economy to try to pick and choose this sector, this company is what's going to drive us going forward. And I think, a state like Connecticut has a lot to offer, but what you need is overall tax climate and regulatory climate and education climate where companies feel like, hey, this is the place we're gonna go locate. And I think when you see that happen, when you see that change, you'll see a lot of different industries coming. I think, Governor Malloy talks a lot about biotech, and I think that's a great industry to encourage, but biotech companies are companies like everyone else. There's a reason the biggest biotech boom in the last few decades has been the Research Triangle in North Carolina, because they also, like us, have a very educated workforce, but then they have great, much more competitive tax policies and regulatory policies. So that's where all the companies go locate.
And let me say this, that if they're in the region, they're obviously looking at Cambridge. They're looking at all the brain power up there. And they've actually got a bit more of a inducing kind of climate today than we do, Massachusetts.
Yeah, absolutely, without question. The old joke is Taxachusetts, but actually that's not really that true right now. If you compare income taxes and, property taxes and just the overall tax climate in Connecticut to Massachusetts. Massachusetts is much lower taxes, much more competitive, regulatory structure, and so not only do they have an existing infrastructure of these companies, but they also have just kind of much more competitive, much more accommodating to businesses' needs, fiscal policies.
Yeah, and if we had, what is that route up there, 128? Is that
yeah.
Right? If we had it, it probably would have all these orange barrels and it would be closed, at least one of the lanes,
Exactly.
Let's be honest about it. When you look at it, they've got Boston. They've got a hub that people want to go to, these brainiacs. They would like to be among, the group up in Boston. We also have these very weak cities that cannot help our situation.
Yeah, let's be honest. I love the state of Connecticut, but it's not a place like New York City where people will move even though the tax policy is terrible because they want to live in New York City. I live in New Haven. I love New Haven, but, people aren't clamoring to live there the way they are New York. And so Connecticut has to think, what are its advantages? What can it take advantage of? And historically, what it's taken advantage of is very competitive fiscal policies. But in the last, 10 to 15 years, Governor Malloy did not start this. It started well before that, but, it's continued under his administration. The fiscal policies and economic climate of the state has given up basically all of those advantages, and we don't have a New York City, and we don't even have a Boston that can kind of serve as a means of attracting that.
I'll continue here because he's got all these incredible charts. 2012 residents employed growth rate. What is this one meant to tell us?
Well, so what this basically tells us is that we're losing jobs in the state. So there's two, and you've heard sort of different politicians argue about what the real job numbers. The Department of Labor does two surveys. They do one of employers and one of residents. And so the one Governor Malloy always likes to cite is the one of employers, where you've seen small growth, but bear in mind, as it says on that chart, among the still about a third of the national growth rate, half of the Northeast growth rate, so we're still ranked terribly even on that metric. But then this other metric where they interview households and say, are you employed? You've actually seen a loss of jobs in Connecticut.
Okay, so folks, let me give you this. The national average, and believe me, all of this is awful news. I mean, none of it. I mean, you can't escape it from C to signing C. 0.80% in 2012. 0.41% Northeast average of residents employed. That's the growth rate of residents employed, at least what people are telling them in combination with employers. In Connecticut, it's down 1.17%. So we rank 9th in the Northeast, again, at the bottom, and 49th in the USA.
Yeah, and what this is telling us is that it's not just, when you look at GDP, that can be influenced disproportionately by certain people. So, if you have some billionaire in Greenwich who makes or loses a ton of money, that can have a sort of disproportionate impact on GDP. But jobs, really tells you the way, common people, everyday people are experiencing the economy. And as the statistics in the report show, the way they're experiencing it is not positive.
Okay, now this is one that I want to make certain we go to the source. The data source is the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, January 2013, Who Pays report. How, objective is this group?
Well, I think it's great you brought that up, because we actually picked that source because they're a left-leaning national think tank, and were recently the source of data for a big report that Connecticut Voices for Children put out. So we picked that source for our tax analysis specifically so that no one could claim this is some sort of skewed right-wing data. If you're going to let it be the data source for all the liberal reports, then you have to let it be the source for ours.
Okay, so let's go at it. The average percent of income each middle-class resident spends on state and local taxes. So you will want to hear this one. Middle-class defined as 5th through 80th income percentiles. Wow, that's a pretty wide berth.
Yeah, I think, the reason we defined it that way is to basically, the idea was to get a sense of the state as a whole and how much people are paying in taxes. But again, that can be a bit skewed by people at the very top and the bottom. And so we wanted to sort of give the sort of typical working people, your average working person in Connecticut, across a wide range, how much they're paying in taxes.
Okay, so the national average of what you're paying out of your income for state and local taxes, 8.68%. The Northeast average, higher, as you would have imagined, 9.21%. Connecticut, 9.79%. So again, here in the U.S., we are 42nd out of 50. Northeast, 8 out of 9. What is the 9th state? Is that Rhode Island? Or
I think it's New York.
New York, okay. All right, so again, middle-class tax burden, and we are 8 of 9 in the Northeast. Now, we're not going to get through all of this, and I will have Ben on, and I don't want to overwhelm you with all these numbers, but I think it gives you the direction. It gives you a sense. State general fund spending per capita. The national average is $2,342. Northeast average, $2,975. Connecticut, now, I've got to ask a question in terms of mitigating this, $5,224. Now, most would argue that it's because we don't have any county anti-government.
I think that's correct, which is why, if you see on that, we also include an index of combined state and local spending, where Connecticut also remains one of the highest states, though it's not quite as high above as when you look only at the general fund.
Okay, so if you look at that number, and again, remind yourself that a lot of these folks have an intermediary, form of government between local and state. But in the U.S., we rank 49th out of 50, and in the Northeast, 9 out of 9. Now, if you take all state and local spending per capita, national average is $98.98. Northeast average $11,008. Connecticut $10,907. We rank 43rd in the U.S. and 6 out of 9 in the Northeast.
Yeah, so you see, again, there our spending is among the higher in the country. And you have to ask, what value are we getting for this spending? We're spending all this, and yet, our education system is failing low-income urban kids. We're losing jobs. So it's not like this spending is investing in making Connecticut a better place. And I think that's, one of the big problems with this. We're having an event tomorrow with John Rathgaber, who's the CEO of the Connecticut Business and Industry Association, and they've put out a study where I think 70% of business leaders in Connecticut didn't feel they were getting their money's worth from the state in terms of what they pay in taxes versus what the government puts out in terms of spending.
And let's be honest about it, Ben. What you are seeing, what I am seeing, is that we've got a real Donnybrook going on between current services and legacy costs. And a lot of those legacy costs, for the third fire department that retired, 20 years ago. I mean, we're not feeling any direct benefit from that, nor should we. We can't, because they can't put on a uniform and go fight a fire at this point. So with all of that, we're seeing this real battle going on between commitments that politicians made saying, I won't be there, you won't be there, let's give them what they want, get their votes, get their support, and we'll get out of here in time before the house burns down.
I mean, that really sums up the problem of what we've seen in Connecticut, where they just borrow and borrow and borrow and promise, these pensions way to the future, and everyone's gone on both sides. One of the things about passing the buck with these pensions is it's also a problem with the union leadership versus everyday union workers of the public unions, because these union leadership are generally older, closer to retirement. The large pensions will be there when they retire, but then all of a sudden when the bill comes due, and in order to pay off the pension obligations, you're talking about raising taxes by orders of magnitude above the huge tax increase we've already seen. There's not going to be the political will for it, and you're going to see, I think, younger public employees get hurt. And so I think that's why one of the things we've advocated is, in a thoughtful way, reducing some of these legacy costs so that they're actually affordable and so that they actually get paid, rather than just being sort of empty promises to help politicians get to the next election.
Well, the next guest that we have on at 11:30 after Open Lines is Steve Malanga. And he writes more about cities and towns and states and their obligations than anyone else in the country. I'll tell you what, let me take a quick break, and then I want to get into one more number, and then welcome Ben back to the program at some point. There's a lot more to go through, but we're not going to, kind of overwhelm you today. Back. Okay, we will get him back, but the total state debt per capita, you've got us 8 out of 9 in the Northeast, 47 in the country. You have a number of 27,540, which is higher than the Northeast average by a lot, but others have said 50,000. Why is your number so low relatively?
Well, the number we use is, from the source we have there, state budget solutions. So obviously, there's different ways you can classify debt, but that number is the ordinary debt plus the pension and healthcare liabilities.
Okay, maybe the general borrowing and so forth. Well, listen, Ben Zimmer, Connecticut Policy Institute, go online, take a look at their Connecticut's economic scorecard. He will be back in about a month, and we'll continue to go through these numbers. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks so much for having me.
WATR, Waterbury.
I'm Dave Anthony. Baseball may